Latter-day Peace Studies is produced by peace-loving members of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Any views expressed herein are not to be taken as official positions of the Church or its authorities.
Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. I'm Shiloh Logan.
And I'm Ben Peterson.
Thank you for joining us as we discuss this week's reading of Come Follow Me, as outlined by The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're recording these podcasts from our homes, and so you'll often hear children playing, dogs barking, and babies crying. This is our life, and we love it. Our hope is that as we discuss these scriptures and truths, we will come to a more perfect understanding through experiencing the atonement of Jesus Christ and find greater peace in our lives.
Okay, hey Shiloh, thanks for having Christopher come and cover for me last week. Thanks, Chris. It's having a good time in Florida. But so I listened to your guys' podcast that you did, and I kept wanting to comment because you're like, oh yeah, I have something to say about that. Oh, I'm just listening to it. But the topic we're getting on today is actually really closely tied with what you guys were talking about last time. So I think it kind of flows into it pretty well. And so it was a good primer for me thinking about those sort of things. And as I came into these sections, it really kind of opened up my mind to some stuff that I hadn't quite considered before. So here we get into, we're doing sections 125 through 128 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And we have some various revelations about gathering. And that seems to kind of be the theme here. So contextually, Joseph Smith, he's out of Liberty Jail. Obviously, he's back in Nauvoo. And from time to time, he's being accused and there's charges out for him and legally, but then also extra legally, there's people that are after him for various reasons, in at the time and what he's talking about. He doesn't, obviously at this point, the doctrine of plural marriage isn't very public. But going back in the historical record at this time, you can see that does account for some of the animosity going on right now. There's other stuff going on as well. But because that wasn't out and publicly known, it was more still a pretty secretive type of thing, then it's not widely known as to necessarily why Joseph is being pursued by some for that purpose. It's, I guess, sort of whispered about, but not publicly accepted as one of the reasons for people being upset with him. So anyway, he's a little bit on the run, so to speak, or in hiding. And some of what's going on is he's writing these letters back to the church. So these are his epistles, so to speak. I think these are kind of chosen out. I'm sure there's more than this, but these were chosen because they had some particular doctrines that were significant in the development of the church and temple worship and so forth. And so these letters were chosen to be included in the Doctrine and Covenants for that significance. This is where we are introduced scripturally to the doctrine of the baptism for the dead, at least in a Latter-day Saint context. So even though this practice and ordinance has developed quite a bit since even this time, this is a new thing for the saints. It's a pretty big deal. It kind of causes what has been termed a revival at the time of the saints. They got all really excited about this and are all going to go out there and perform this ordinance and seem to be doing it wrong at first. And then Joseph Smith comes back and says, no, you have to do it this way. And then, he's constantly giving him additional instruction before he finally says, actually, you can't just go in the river and do it at all. We have to do it in the temple. So again, this is a developing type of mode for the saints, but it's a very powerful one, again, instituted at this time, that then finds its way into all the other ordinances of the temple. So we end up not just doing baptisms for the dead, but the ordinances of the temple get performed on behalf of the dead as proxy for all the other ordinances. So this is where the concept of that proxy comes into being in Latter-day Saint doctrine. As we go through these sections here, Joseph Smith is writing to the saints. He's kind of explaining his situation. and then giving them instructions. He's very excited about this. And I think a lot of that excitement, really does bleed over to the saints, and they catch up on that. So we're going to read some of the reactions that they have and so forth. But starting off in section 125, the saints had purchased lands in Nauvoo Commerce, which is the Illinois side of the Mississippi, but there was also some lands purchased on the Iowa side. The issue with the lands that were purchased on the Iowa side is that it wasn't clear that the person they purchased them from actually owned them and had a right to sell them. And so what ends up happening is kind of a dubious ownership of these lands, and it actually ended up causing some financial problems as well. But not much really ever comes of that in terms of church settlement. There are people that live there. And in this section, they're said they're going to name it Zarahemla. It never really becomes anything close to what Nauvoo ever became. And just doesn't have the time to develop in that way. There weren't bridges at the time that could span the Mississippi. Everything was done by ferry. So it was very difficult to really have a coherent society and city on both sides of this really wide river. There's only a couple years after this, and then large body of the saints ends up moving west, so that's kind of abandoned. Here we have this concept of gathering, right? And this is a recurring theme in the early church, and then has been very much doctrinized and codified for the church up until today as well. This concept of gathering. The actual practice of it has evolved and changed somewhat over time. At this point, the gathering is get everybody into these areas, into these cities. This is causing some anxiety for people because this was sort of what was done in Kirtland, right? And then this was what was done in Jackson County. And then this is what was done in Caldwell County. All these calls to always gather. And every time they gathered as a big group of a community, it always caused problems. They felt like they were persecuted. And so there was really a lot of discussion at this time about whether they should really gather or whether they should not be dispersed into smaller communities all over the place so that people would leave them alone because they didn't have any particular community power. But still, Joseph is calling them to gather. And the Lord wants them to come and build a temple together and be instructed. I can see the utility here because, again, at this point, these doctrines are still being developed. This identity is still being forged. And if you have the people that are still very disparate, it's very difficult to forge that united identity of a church that then can persist as a community and has persisted for so long after that. You keep people dispersed, and especially in a day when communication was not so good, it's very difficult to forge, again, that unique identity and common doctrine and so forth among the saints. So this concept of gathering becomes very important at this time, even if it does end up always causing them some problems. Yeah, I should stop there. You should talk now.
I was enjoying what you had to say. I think the gathering idea there is really great because it should, just in context, because they've been tossed around so much, right? Because they got kicked out of Jackson, they got kicked out of Clay, they got kicked out of Kirtland, they got kicked out of Caldwell, they got kicked out of Davies, got kicked out of Missouri. So now they're finally here in Nauvoo. And, as we've talked about before, they weren't completely innocent from having, the effects of that. That doesn't mean to say that it was justified. There were so many extra legal and illegal acts performed against the saints, but the justification for it had some merit, right? So it's not that these persecutions happened in a vacuum. And then, but at every turn, they're always trying to retrench and to regather back together, right? So that gathering, you're right, is really important. And even today, the mode of communication of being able to gather is still really important. I mean, that's why there's hot topics in politics going on right now about who gets to have a Twitter account and who gets to have a Facebook account and what's Facebook's culpability right now for the January 6th insurrection, right? Because these are the modes of communication that gather people together. And so what did the saints have, and how did their gatherings work together, and what were the important methods by which they gathered together, and what were the narratives and the ideas and the reason that kept that community together when there was so much political upheaval going on and social upheaval going on, and there were people who were on the highest echelons of the church who were leaving the church who were claiming some pretty interesting things that had some pretty interesting basis and merit for it going on. And so there's a lot of moving parts to this discussion. And I don't think a lot of the time we get down into recognizing just how uncertain their future seemed so often along the way. And just that gathering, I liked how you brought up the concept of gathering as a means of bringing that community together and having that communication there and the importance of it. Here in sections 127 and 128, these are not revelations. These are letters from Joseph to the saints. And I think in them being letters, there's a lot of clues that we get in these sections that we don't get in the Revelations. And we've talked about this before, about what was Joseph in the Revelation and what was God, and trying to kind of piece out and find out what was Joseph. Is this God pouring through the cracks, or is this Joseph? We talked a little bit about that with 121 and 123. What did Joseph need to heal from the traumas that Joseph needed? And maybe those revelations were really tailored to his needs. We didn't get a whole lot of all the revelations at 121 and 123 that were given. We only got a little bit there about what I believe Orson Pratt and Brigham Young ended up deeming to appropriate to put into sections 121 through 123. And so, but here in these sections, we're getting a lot more of the flavor of Joseph. And like, for instance, here in verse 1 of section 127, he goes into hiding because he says, "I have thought it expedient." Well, that's really different language than what we're usually what we're accustomed to in these sections, because it's always in the name of God, right? Always in the name of the Lord. The Lord's always speaking about himself in third person, which is really an interesting way of being able to give these revelations. And then he switches to first person a lot. But I have thought it expedient. And then in verse 2, this is fascinating. He says, "As for the perils which I am called to pass through, they seem but a small thing to me, as the envy and wrath of man have been my common lot all the days of my life, and for what cause it seems mysterious." This is a really interesting thing for Joseph. Joseph, obviously, we know, down in Missouri, the July 4th sermon that Sidney Rigdon gave that was so bombastic that even Brigham Young and the later apostles were like, yeah, that was the speech that probably really catalyzed the Missourians against us and caused the extermination order. So even later on, they're admitting this. Joseph helped co-author it. He helped disseminate it. He thought it was a really good idea to do this. And to put out all these materials all over and share through their Missourian neighbors. Joseph thought this was a great idea. But then on the backside, he's like, why is everybody upset with us? Right? And so there's a little bit of this going on. And I don't think as a religious community, we really grapple with this. We tend to put Joseph in such an absolute perfected stance that nothing he ever did merited any animosity. It was always this conspiracy against him. And I think in a lot of ways, his personality, he may not have even been aware of what he was doing or how he may have been completely sideswiped and blindsided by the Missourian animosity for the Salt Sermon and for the July 4th sermons that happened in 1838. But then he comes along here and he's like, for what cause it seems mysterious. But here's what I think is really interesting is how he follows up this statement about his common lot for what seems mysterious. Because he writes in 1838, in the account that we have of the Joseph Smith history and the end of the Pearl of Great Price, that he writes in 1838 That's where, that's the first vision story we have. And he talks about the persecutions he seen back then and about how shocked he was about the persecutions back then. So this is kind of an MO that Joseph has, is he's like, I don't know why everybody dislikes me so much. And then but there's clues along the way of saying, nothing I think Joseph did merited the kind of pushback that Joseph had. But there's always these kinds of people who, there's little things that they do that cause some of the problems that they end up experiencing. And I think in a lot of ways, not every way, but at least in some subtle ways, Joseph is like this. And so, but what I find is fascinating is his ability to cope with and then to create meaning and modality in his own life. So for instance, he says, as the envy and wrath of man have been a common lot all the days of my life, and for what cause it seems mysterious, unless I was ordained from before the foundation of the world for some good end or bad, as you may choose to call it, judge ye yourselves, God knoweth these things, whether it be good or bad. I think this is a really fascinating way to put this. If you can imagine the stream of consciousness that he's in, this unless I was ordained, it's like he's trying to make sense of his life experience. And as he's developing this Mormon cosmology from like 1838 until 1841, especially as he's really getting involved in building this Mormon cosmology, this concept of being ordained from the foundation of the world harkens a lot back to the Abraham, the book of Abraham. And then he turns to whether or not that's good or bad, whatever you choose to call it, I'll just let you choose to call it, whatever God thinks. And so this kind of self-awareness, I think, is really it's a paradox. This is what makes Joseph Smith such a hard figure to try to nail down
sometimes.
Yeah. Because sometimes he seems so clueless as to his self-awareness. And then because he's actively engaged and he makes a lot of foibles and he's hot-tempered a lot of the time. He's quick to anger a lot, but he's also insanely loyal. And he's usually very quick to forgive if someone actually comes up and asks for forgiveness. So he's got sometimes these contradicting virtues and behaviors. Yeah. And so here, but he's like, judge for yourself. God knoweth these things, whether it be good or bad. But nevertheless, deep water is what I want to swim in. It has become second nature to me, and I feel like Paul to glory and tribulation. I think that kind of self-awareness, though, is really important in kind of beginning to understand Joseph. But as we've talked about with Latter-day Contemplation, with Riley and Christopher, and when I was recording with Riley when we very first started, one of the things we talked about is this idea of creating our own contention or creating our own problems, as it were. And sometimes we can get into narratives and ways of being and ways of thinking and just ways of projecting and seeing the world that we kind of throw out self-fulfilling prophecy. And then at that point, we end up seeing that the pain that we feel or the struggle itself, I've called this the trap of the struggle, that a lot of the times we think that because we're struggling, that becomes indicative that we're following the right path. And I think at least a little bit, Joseph gets used to this and kind of uses that as his own meaning, that as he's struggling, that actually kind of shows that he's on the right path. So in this, I want to swim in deep waters. This is how we typically cope with, we have an unaddressed part of ourself that sometimes we throw out in front of us that causes problems, and then we use that as the meaning that what we're doing is right. And as
it's supposed to be this way.
Yeah, it's supposed to be this way. This is my validation that this is the right path. And I think that way of thinking is largely what led to a lot of problems in Missouri, is because that was kind of the standard MO, not just for Joseph, but as I've read other people's journals and other people's lives and books on the subject, it seems to be that this was, and this is just standard human nature. I have countless friends, even myself included, and people in my life that this was a standard way of being, that sometimes we project out in front of us and we create our own problems. And then the struggle, we find meaning in the struggle, that because we had these problems and we overcame them, then that shows that we're on the right path. And so I see a lot of that going with Joseph, but here's what I think is really cool about him, is that he's always turning to God to he always keeps circling back to God and coming back to that. And I think regardless of whether or not we create our own problems or whether or not life just happens, this is one of those things that everything happens for a reason, and usually that's because we're dumb and make bad choices. And whether or not life is just being life, or we're making bad choices, or whatever it is, what I think this shows is that Joseph is returning back over and over and over again to the Lord as a way of making that kind of the center of his modality in finding peace and assurance and in finding a way forward. Because as we'll see in the end of 128, he gets really excited about this baptisms for the dead and what he's becoming aware of in creating that modality. And as you and I talked earlier, you brought up the fact that this was kind of a rejuvenating doctrine that kind of revitalized the saints again.
Almost ironically, right? Being baptism for the dead, revitalizing.
Yeah, well, right. But isn't that the point? It's almost like that is the point. So yeah, it's very fascinating.
What you were talking about there with verse 2 of section 127 is very interesting to me. The fact here that he talks about how all these quote unquote bad things have happened to him, he doesn't directly label them as such. And then he says here, unless I was ordained from before the foundation of the world to some good end. And just like you were saying, it's like all of these bad things that have happened to me are evidence that I'm on the right path, right? To some good end. And people are like, well, these are all bad things. How could that be good? He says, well, or bad, as you may choose to call it. And I think he's kind of coming back to this realization, like you said, coming back to God and saying, you know what? I don't know whether to call the things that have happened to me good or bad. I can't call them good or bad. They just are. And it must be the way that God wants it to be. And so whether it's good or bad, God is going to judge that. I just know that I'm swimming in deep water, right? And deep water can be good or bad, right? If you've got to float a lot of stuff, you need deep water for it. So I just think that's an interesting perspective there, that he kind of steps back from judging his circumstances to say, you know what, I don't know whether my circumstances are good or bad. I've come to just accept them. They just are what they are, and I'm willing to, at least in this moment, accept reality for what it is. And obviously, as a human, that always oscillates, right? We'll come to moments where we're willing to just accept reality for what it is, and then tomorrow someone cuts us off, and it's like, they're the devil. So these kinds of things happen.
Yeah. I don't know how to follow that up, but yeah.
That's fine. So here, as he continues in 127, I saw something that was an interesting segue into this concept of the baptism for the dead. So here he starts introducing this idea, or the idea is that he's already introduced it to the saints. We get this letter here that he tells them, oh, they already know about it, so they've already been doing it, and he's just giving them further instruction. So essentially, in the Doctrine and Covenants, we don't have the letter that's originally the instruction, or if it was an in-place or an in-person instruction, as he says later in here that he wanted to, be there in person to instruct them further on this. But here we get in verse 4 an interesting segue into the concept of recording. So, and again, verily, thus saith the Lord, let the work of my temple and all the works which I have appointed unto you be continued on and not cease, and let your diligence and your perseverance and patience in your works be redoubled, and you shall in no wise lose your reward, saith the Lord of hosts. And if they persecute you, so persecuted they the prophets and righteous men that were before you. For all this there is a reward in heaven. This is a bit of a reformulation of the last beatitude, right? That blessed are you if you're persecuted for righteousness' sakes, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. That's basically, this is a reformulation of that. what's interesting to me about that is that the very idea of recording these ordinances now becomes a mode by which heaven and earth are united. And this is how he gets into this. He says, concerning your dead, when any of you are baptized for your dead, let there be a recorder, and let him eyewitness of your baptisms. Let him hear with his ears, that he may testify of a truth, saith the Lord. That in all your recordings it may be recorded in heaven. Whatsoever you bind on earth may be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you loose on earth may be loosed in heaven. So here we kind of get introduced to the concept that it's not just the ordinance itself of baptism that's the mode of experiencing God or entering into the kingdom of heaven, right? It's the recording of this act and the witnessing of this act that in and of themselves are also modes for experiencing God and experiencing the kingdom of heaven. And so that's a very interesting way of positing an administrative task like recording something as being a spiritual exercise that actually brings one into a relationship with the divine. He kind of recognizes that this is a bit of an odd thing to assert. So he kind of says later, you may seem to think or think that it's a strange doctrine, but this is an important thing. And then he goes on to explain why he thinks that way. But it kind of stood out to me this time that, again, just the very concept of recording the ordinance in and of itself kind of becomes an ordinance, right? Becomes a mode by which a person experiences a relationship with God and then establishes this kingdom of heaven on earth, the meeting of heaven and earth in the kingdom of God. So this, again, at this time, this gets the saints really excited about this and how they're going to experience this new mode, right? They know what baptism is, but all of a sudden, baptism gets extended into a way of experiencing God, uniting with their ancestors, right? In a way that they really hadn't ever considered before. It opens up their minds to a realization of something they hadn't before. So here's some of the accounts. There's several that come from people that experience this, but this is Phoebe Woodruff, who's Wilford Woodruff's wife. So Phoebe Woodruff was living near Nauvoo when Joseph Smith began teaching about baptism for the dead. She wrote about it to her husband, Wilford, who was serving a mission in England. She says, Brother Joseph has learned by revelation that those in this church may be baptized for any of their relatives who are dead and had not a privilege of hearing the gospel, even for their children, parents, brothers, sisters, grandparents, uncles, and aunts. As soon as they are baptized for their friends, they are released from prison, and they can claim them in the resurrection and bring them into the celestial kingdom. This doctrine is cordially received by the church, and they are going forward in multitudes. Some are going to be baptized as many as 16 times in one day. Wilford Woodruff later said of this principle, the moment I heard of it, my soul leaped with joy. I went forward and was baptized for all my dead relatives I could think of. I felt to say hallelujah when the revelation came forth, revealing to us baptism for the dead. I felt that we had a right to rejoice in the blessings of heaven. This does kind of cause this revival among the saints that really puts them back in touch with the roots of their religion, kind of breathes more life, new life into these modes that they had, and energizes them to do the work. And then as this concept's introduced, it leads into Joseph Smith then starts explaining to them that this ordinance actually should be done in the temple. So it's a way for him to first galvanize the spiritual energy, so to speak, or will of the saints, and then channel it into that mode of the temple and say, okay, this is something that is very important to you. You've realized it. You've experienced this as a mode of experiencing God. Let's take this and then put it in the sacred space of the temple to elevate it even further. And so that's a very interesting thing to do, to take something that they're experiencing and then further sanctify it by moving it into a designated sacred space. And that was really interesting in light of the discussion you had with Christopher last week, I thought, because you guys brought up the concept of not just sacred space, but sacred time. And the fact that an ordinance is something that you perform from start to finish, and you're experiencing it in time. It's not just going to a space and thinking, you're actually doing something. So it's a dedication of time. That's where I see that sort of that sacred time being brought into the conversation here, because you're offering that time as part of the sacrifice. You're making that time holy that you're putting into it, not just the space that you built, right? And we see that, if a baptism is something quick, but we see that even further pronounced in the following ordinances that are revealed and then performed in the temple, because especially like initiatory and endowment, these are much lengthier types of ordinances that, depending on what temple they're done in and the group size and everything, can take a couple hours, right? Just to do one name for one person. And so this becomes, again, not just a concept of a sacred space, but also of a sacred time. That time is set apart to the Lord and then to that person, that specific person. And what becomes very central and important to these ordinances of the temple are the names of the people. And because the names are so important and absolutely required to even do the ordinance, they are like central to the ordinance itself. That means that we then have to go and do that family history work, right? To find the names of these people, because those are what are the central part of the ordinance that is spoken in the ordinance, are the names of these people. So that got me remembering an article that I had read years ago, and I went to search for it and I couldn't find it. But the concept in the article was the idea of how the temple, it's the idea that temple work is a sort of response to the collectivism that so often creeps up in the world. So we can look over history and see how people get treated collectively. You have war, you have genocides, all these horrible things that happen to people en masse. And so atrocities and war. And this results in sort of a collective death. And the temple kind of responds to that as the antithesis of a collective death. It's an individual symbolic resurrection. And so we symbolize resurrection in baptism by going down into the font. And Joseph talks about this in section 128, even the symbolism of baptism himself. He brings this up as an important point to the idea of baptism for the dead. He says, this very ordinance is symbolizing someone dying and being reborn. So it totally makes sense that we would do this for our dead, in proxy for them, because they are dead. And so we're symbolizing their rebirth. And so again, going back to this idea that the temple is sort of the religious mode response to the idea of collective death, and that is of individual resurrection, as symbolized by performing these ordinances on an individual level, and with the idea that speaking the name of the person is akin to resurrecting them. Okay, now this is a very strong symbol within LDS liturgy, but it goes back way back to Egyptian times. And this idea very well could have been planted in Joseph's mind by his exposure to Egyptian religious practice. And the idea is that the resurrection, a person is resurrected by speaking their name. And so this is what happens in the temple. We go through all these ordinances and we speak these people's name, because then they are receiving what they need in order to progress and be resurrected and have that relationship with God. And then it brings us into that same relationship there. So as I was searching for this article that said this and thinking about this concept, I came across another article that was written back in 2004. And it was an article that was talking about, the context of it was the Iraq War and all of the awful things that were happening in Iraq after the U.S. invasion. And it was talking about how speaking the names of people who had died was this way to humanize, to rehumanize, to reanimate these people who had died in this war that was in such a dehumanizing way. They then talked about it in the context of other mass casualties. So, either from accidents or different things. So this comes up when we talk about 9/11 as well. It's they still have, I think, sort of a ceremony where they say the names of those people, right? And this we do this with like war memorials. Like there's the Vietnam War Memorial. We have the people's names written on the memorial. This was really not a thing almost at all before World War I. In fact, a lot of graves, especially for casualties of war, weren't even marked. Now, this was largely like a logistical problem. Like, you didn't know what everybody was named. Dog tags weren't a thing, right? But the fact is, it's more of a modern innovation to seek out and try to name everybody that's killed in the war. I wanted to read a few things from the article that I found, and I thought maybe we could post a link to it or something in the episode notes. Here's some of the things I found in the article that were really interesting. It says, naming names after an event with mass casualties is a way of pausing to say, wait, to a world in a hurry. And I thought that was interesting in the context of, we've talked about a lot how we are so often in a hurry, and the Lord wants us to slow down and experience things in the moment, right? So going on in the article, a way of acknowledging in the midst of vast abstractions culled from numbers and graphs and tallies that the most important number ought to be 1. What's that quote from Stalin? Like 1 death is a tragedy, but 1,000,000 is a statistic, right? And it's the idea here that we come back to that individual, right? We don't go in the temple and say, okay, we're going to do an ordinance for, I'm doing an ordinance for 50 people, right? They're all done individually, one at a time, with that person's name, because that person is an individual. Another part from the article, the act of reading aloud the names of the dead, the late 20th century's contribution to that individualizing impulse. Stepping out of that article for a second, one of the premises of the article is that this idea of speaking the names of people is sort of a modern innovation. Like I said, only since really World War I have we tried to collect names of people who died in wars and tried to keep a record of that. But Joseph Smith started teaching the saints here to go and find those and find their ancestors. Not particular to war, obviously, and that their names were an important part of this process. So going back to the article, reading aloud the names of the dead is even more emotionally charged than the act of silently reading inscriptions on a monument. It adds a temporal extension. It takes a place in time. You can see a memorial in one moment in time. There is this extra dimension, an oral one, he says. So this again reminded me of what you and Christopher were talking about last week with the sacred space and the sacred time, that speaking someone's name actually is something that takes time to do. You're not just thinking about it or not just reading it, but like you're speaking it out loud, and it exists in time, but then it also exists in sound. Like we have to hear it. That reminded me then again of multiple times here in these sections where it talks about the witness not just seeing the ordinance, but then hearing it as well. And that seeing and hearing were part of that recording mode, right? So it kind of all fits in with this concept that the person is symbolically being resurrected, not just in space, because you're there in a sacred space, not just in time, because you're taking the time out of your life to do this and to speak their name and to experience these ordinances, but also you're seeing and hearing, right? So they're being resurrected into all these different dimensions in all these different ways that are sort of branches of this mode. So one last part from the article that I thought was pertinent. It says, such incantatory rituals have the magic of the name as being the person, right? Let's hear that again. The magic of the name is the person. It's a very old and very deep notion. It says, reading aloud names is a public ritual. It's theater. You have to be engaged. So I just thought that was interesting here, that this was almost like from a civic religion point of view, right? They were talking about it in terms of a community, but they also talked about how it was a pushback on politics, because at the time in 2004, this is a very, very highly politicized, right? The invasion of Iraq. And so that bringing up people's names that have died in war was a way of kind of pushing it back against politics and the state, because of the tools that they used of war to perpetrate these things. The way that you pushed it back against that was to name the people that were killed, so that they didn't become a statistic, but that they were an actual real person that was a consequence of the choices that these people had made to go to war. So again, the idea that the name of that person is a type of magic, right? They say magic, but in our experience, it's a symbolic way of resurrecting that person that gives us a spiritual connection, sometimes with them, but certainly with God, as we come to know Christ and how it was that he made a connection with us by being our proxy, right? One of the parts here in section 128, verse 8, it says, "Now the nature of this ordinance consists in the power of the priesthood by the revelation of Jesus Christ." In our experiences that we have with ordinances or modes of connecting with God, how is it that Christ is revealed to us in those things? And I think that there's quite a bit that we could look at here in terms of how we treat temple ordinances, and this concept of speaking names and resurrecting and proxy, that reveals to us more about Christ and what it means for us to have taken upon ourselves his name. Again, coming back to that name.
Yeah, there is so much there that you just talk.
There is. I know, there's a lot.
I've been like writing down notes. I'm like, oh, that's good. Yeah, that's good. That's good. But one of the things I keep coming around and back to is this idea of this synthesis that Joseph is going through, because he talks about, like, for instance, in section 128, in verse 1, he says, "And now I resume the subject of the baptism for the dead, as that subject seems to occupy my mind and to press itself on my feelings the strongest since I have been pursued by my enemies." So, this is something that he's thinking about a lot. He's poring over this. And one of the things that historians have talked about Joseph is that he is a product of his time, and certain things will influence what he's thinking about and will spark ideas. And so during this time, what is it about this name? Because this seems so otherworldly. Everything that we're talking about here with this whole new doctrine about the baptism for the dead, and like, where is this coming from? And he's not even claiming that this is revelation that's coming directly from God, because this isn't being given in the voice of God. This is given in the voice of him reasoning these things. And he's talking about just, I've thought these things expedient, and I've been interested in this, and I've had these excited feelings about this. And so I know in my life the difference is when I come across a subject that sparks a question, and then I start following that rabbit trail all the way down, and I begin to learn new things, and new things open up for me, versus those moments of spontaneous, what I call revelation for myself, where just something that seems to be completely counter my trajectory comes in and kind of takes me from the side, and I call those more revelatory moments. But here we are right as section 127 and 128 are given. This is September 1st and September 6th of 1842. And a couple things are going on in Nauvoo at this time. Number one, polygamy and plural marriage, and you brought this up before. These things are just starting to come on. In fact, Joseph Smith's first plural wife that nobody knows about, not even Emma knows about Joseph's polygamy, happens in April of 1841. So more than a year before this. And once it starts, it kind of snowballs, and it goes pretty quick. So by this time, Joseph has had probably quite a few wives. And so this thing of plural marriage, eternal marriage, what they call celestial, the celestial marriages, and of these for eternity sealings are starting to coalesce. And if you can have marriage throughout eternity that endures through eternity, and if you do certain things in this life that will be sealed in the next life, we also know that Joseph, the death of Alvin, really, really impacted Joseph, probably more than any other thing in his young adult life. And in fact, they noted that it affected the family more so than just what you would think a family would grieve for the loss of the oldest son. He said they grieved more than even that. And so it was a really tragic moment, and especially so tragic because, the minister there at his gravesite tells him that he wasn't baptized. He was going to hell. And Joseph is later revealed that no, Alvin is okay, right? But then now we're starting to say, well, how is that even possible if everyone has to be baptized? And if you can imagine Joseph going through and reading the scriptures, and in 127 he gives us several scriptures. In 128 he gives us several scriptures that it looks like he's starting to pore over. These are scriptures that are coming to his mind that are giving him ideas. We have scriptures from Revelation. We have the famous scripture from 1 Corinthians about 15:29. Else what shall they do which are baptized for the dead? If the dead not rise at all, then why are they then baptized for the dead? And then going back, because even Malachi 10, or the scripture in Malachi there is about the hearts of the children to the father and the fathers to the children. This has been really important since the angel Moroni appeared to him, right? And so that's been there. Then he's dealing with this sealing on earth and sealing in heaven, but this isn't connected with polygamy. He's been dealing with this with the plural marriage issue now for at least a full year, if not longer, about this whole sacred sealing moment. And so now as he's poring over these scriptures, another really big issue that happens is just a few months before this in April, Freemasonry enters Nauvoo, and Joseph is made a master mason. So this is another huge issue that Joseph is going through now, and you can tell there's influences of that. Because in Masonry, just like the LDS Temple, it's a drama. It's this spiritual drama that comes in there. And in the Masonic drama, it's about this fictional character named Hiram Abiff, who is King Solomon's, basically he's hired to be the chief architect for the temple project.
He's the architect for the temple.
Right. And Hiram Abiff is then approached by 2 or 3 people who want Hiram to give him the sacred signs and tokens of Masonry. The idea is that anciently, that with these guilds, these professions, Masons and carpenters and priests, they all had their own stories, and they all had their own secret handshakes. They all had their own secret passwords. They all had their own secret signs, and it was usually part of a story that they would enact. And so the idea is that since college education and being able to show you my college certificate wasn't a thing, that you would come in and you would, according to the level of proficiency that you would have in your particular guild, you would be taught a particular story with a particular handshake, a particular sign, and that would show your proficiency in that guild. And so this is how Masonry is built, that all of the degrees of Mason are the proficiency that you've had in Masonry. And the thing is this is how the word priestcraft comes along, because even priests had their own guild. They had their own story. They had their own handshakes. They had their signs, that you never sold these signs and tokens for money, because what would happen is that would break apart the professionalism of your guild. Because if all of a sudden people who were not trained in your guild started to have all the secret signs of like a master's degree or a PhD or even a bachelor's degree, and all of a sudden people could just know the story without having to gone through the work of being able to master the craft, then it weakens the modality of your craft. It weakens the entire structure. Because you need to keep that sacrosanct. You need to keep those secret and those things secret, because that protects the integrity of what this
sacred and profane. Yeah.
And so this can actually enter into sacred and profane narratives as well. But back in anciently, and especially in medieval, these guilds, these secret guilds, especially in medieval Europe, became a very big deal. This is how they were able to keep the integrity of Masons and as carpenters, and especially craftsmen, metallurgists. They would have their own stories. And in Masonry, it's a story of Hiram Abiff, who's approached by 2 people who want Hiram to give him the signs and tokens of a master mason, or of someone of his stature, of the head architect. And Hiram disagrees and won't allow it, so they kill him. And so part of the reenactment there is that they're trying to bring him back to life. And so the initiation here is that he's murdered, but now he's restored to a new state of awareness, and he now and so the initiate becomes a master mason in the same vein where he stands as Hiram Abiff, coming into a new awareness, a new rebirth. And so Joseph has gone through this thing within a few months of these letters. So the whole concept of rebirth, of coming into a new rebirth, of coming into a new awareness of something, mixed with the scriptures that he's reading, mixed with the concept of this plural marriage throughout eternities, mixed with the idea of sealing on earth and sealing in heaven, all of a sudden you can see that there's a lot of layers upon layers upon layers that Joseph is experiencing here, that having a specific name and the importance of a name and speaking your name in Masonry is a big deal. To be able to have your name attached to this thing is a really big deal in how you're called forward into a new life. And so a lot of these things are kind of Masonry isn't ancient. The oldest records, I believe, and it's been a long time since I've looked at this, but it's like 1300 for, the 13th, 12th century is about as far back of Masonry as we know. But we begin to see that some of these things that Joseph has are really catalysts of what he's dealing with. And I love there in section 121, he's like, these things, this is a subject that occupies my mind and presses itself upon the feelings and of my heart, basically. And you can see just how excited he is about this modality. And as you said about how the saints became about this, because there are a few men in the background who are working with Joseph with polygamy. There's a new Mormon cosmology that's emerging. You have all of the pain that we talked about earlier on about being displaced and the spirit of gathering. And all of a sudden, this new concept of baptisms for the dead becomes a catalyst that begins to synthesize a lot of these ideas into one thing that kind of starts to make sense out of the whole thing. So now we can actually go back to the people we love, because there's always this idea in Christianity that if baptism is an absolute necessity and ordinance to be able to get into heaven, how do we deal with people who would never had that opportunity? And is there a just God? And so what this does is it breaks open this new modality and this new understanding of God, because before then, you just think that God was a jerk. And he's like, well, that person gets destined for hell. And you can begin to see how like Calvin came to Calvin's ideas that only certain people were destined to and predestined to be in heaven, and the rest were just predestined to be in hell. So it wasn't really anything that you could do for it. But Mormon theology flipped the script on Calvinism, and it was like, no, you can actually work your own way into the grace of God. And that was a very strong component. John Brooks talks about that in Refiner's Fire, about how this new Mormon cosmology really ended up kind of even sidestepping the atonement in some ways that maybe even modern Latter-day Saints wouldn't be comfortable with. And that they felt that they could very much, almost like a stairway to heaven, and a form of alchemy, to where they could actually alchemize their own salvation. And at least get to a place where you could earn, or that after all you could do, then is God's grace sufficient for you. But it was very much a ladder that if there is a need for God's grace, it required your own actions, and your own actions could get you there. And so there's just a lot of this going on, to where when baptism becomes a thing and we realize that God accepts baptism, on the other side of the veil, then all of a sudden God's not the jerk that maybe we thought God was before, that actually maybe he does want us to succeed. Maybe he does want everybody to actually get completely united together. And so if you come from a point of view where there's none of that, where there's no answer that you have for people who've died and not been baptized, are they just going to go to hell? But now Joseph comes up with this, having been synthesized from so many different layers, and I've just brought up a couple of these. Now it breaks this open into this new modality of saying, no, God loves all of his children. And even in the construct of baptism and of these ordinances and these rites and their arguable necessity, the God's saying these are going to be open for everyone. Now everyone can literally be saved who wants to be saved.
Yeah, I mean, I see that here. I was thinking about what you were talking about with the concept of introducing this as a way of uniting everyone. So here in verse 15, and now, my dearly beloved brethren and sisters, let me assure you that these are principles in relation to the dead and the living that cannot be lightly passed over as pertaining to our salvation. For their salvation is necessary and essential to our salvation. As Paul says concerning the fathers, that they without us cannot be made perfect, neither can we without our dead be made perfect. You know, it kind of ties this concept in that he's saying, okay, you can be saved, but the way that you do it is by making sure everyone else is too. And it does bring up a lot of questions, with like Mormon theology and what the place of the atonement and faith and works is in that. And that dance has been going on for decades, and, exactly where to put our finger on it is probably difficult. But you were talking earlier about the synthesis that he's creating because of all of these different experiences and understandings that he's coming to. And I see that as, especially in this letters, we're getting all of his thoughts and musings, but he's not at least in these letters able to quite articulate exactly what the core of these revelations are he's receiving. He's rather articulating what it is that's coming into his consciousness about how to construct a mode that sort of conforms to these deeper principle revelations experiences that he's having. So what I mean by that is that there's some principle or concept that he's feeling and having a revelation about that pertains to the idea of uniting the human family, right? That seems to be at the core of this. He talks about the summum bonum here. The whole subject that's lying before us consists in obtaining the powers of the holy priesthood. And so he's bringing this, like you said, the synthesis. He's bringing in this priesthood that he's been talking about for a long time. He's bringing in this work for the dead, the concept of the temple, and a lot of that is now being united under this principle of baptism for the dead. He sees this as a mode by which he can express all of these other revelations that he's having that can't be articulated in a linguistic way. They can only be articulated through an experience. And the way that you have this experience of these principles and understandings that he's having from God is by experiencing these ordinances, by going through these ordinances. Then as you do this, you'll be able to come to a better understanding of what it is that I'm trying to tell you. And I can't tell you any other way but to give you an experience and have you go through that experience, right? And this is exactly what happens with the endowment, right? Like he's got all these things that he wants to teach, and then, like you were saying, he experiences all of the things of Freemasonry, and then he goes to Brigham Young and basically says, "Hey, there's all of these things that we're trying to present. You could use this or something like it as a mode to present those things." And so it becomes the vehicle by which he tries to deliver these principles and understandings and concepts. But it's not the thing, right? He's trying to convey these things that aren't he can't articulate any other way.
Yeah. I think that's a good way of being able to do that. It's this wonderful evolution, and I don't think a lot of the times we really pay attention enough to recognize. History is easy to be read backwards. It doesn't mean we read it well. It's just it's easier that way. And especially with a lot of our religious traditions, it's that this is the way that it has evolved in our lifetime. So I think a lot of the times we think that we kind of project the way it is now back to then, sure. As if this was the way that that they understood it. And we could even rationalize it and say, it's been an ongoing, is it President Nelson who said that, this is an ongoing restoration, right? So it's even what Joseph Smith revealed. I don't know how many Latter-day Saints would even recognize the church in Joseph Smith's day, even in 1842 Nauvoo, because they are so radically just coming up with these new ideas and experiencing these new ideas and the synthesis of how these are all coming to be. Because, Joseph has been told to build the house, to build the temple, to build God's house there, and to say, hey, I'm going to reveal to you these ordinances. Yeah,
it's not really even clear, especially to the saints at this time, what it's really for.
Right.
Like, they just keep saying, build it, and I'm going to, reveal stuff to it. And they're just like, okay, we're going to build it. I'm sure Joseph Smith had a little bit of an idea, but all of that is still developing at this time, what this temple is even for.
Yeah. And so we've had the call to be able to build the endowment house or the Nauvoo, to build the Nauvoo house, and to have that be a temporary endowment house until the temple can be built, because God recognizes that they're in their poverty, he says. And so we can see that, but what's in the endowment house and what are they actually doing? And this is different now than what is being done in the temple, right? Because it's not a full 4-part drama. Because now we have the full 4-part drama. We got the baptism, the initiatory, and the endowment and the sealing. So there's that standard 4-part drama. You can add another act with the second anointing, and whatever that becomes for sure. Leaders of the church. But so that's the standard 4-part drama, and that doesn't really get developed in Joseph's day. Mm-hmm. In fact, they don't open up the Nauvoo temple until after Joseph is dead. So Joseph doesn't actually even get to see the temple endowment as we know it. Yeah,
a lot of this modality really isn't fleshed out by Joseph Smith. It's This is a very Brigham Young thing.
Yeah. So more of what we know about the temple endowment, it has far more Brigham Young's fingerprint on it than it does even Joseph's. And Brigham Young even said he had a dream of seeing Joseph, where Joseph said it was incomplete, and Brigham's got to forward this on and to create a new modality and to continue to work this out. And then we end up getting Adam God theory.
I don't think he used the word modality, Chad.
All right. He didn't say the word modality, but we still ended up getting Adam God theory. But that, that's a whole different other conversation. So there was that moment, and then everyone's like, yeah, let's not continue with that. So then they change it, and it's amended, and it continues even in our own day. It continues to be amended. And there are central rites and tokens that we just don't have anymore that was present 30 years ago. And so it is, and it's going to continue to change, and that's okay, because the modality is not, it's not the
thing.
It's not the thing. It's always symbolic of the thing.
The vehicle.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. And so I think a lot of the times we tend to make the temple the thing in itself. And like we talked about last week, though, is that no, the temple is not it. It represents what is it, and what it is us. And we need to remember that these are symbolic of us. And so when we go to the temple and when we participate in those, to train our minds to be able to thinking, what is this about myself that I'm learning? That is being instructed at this particular, and when we see the temple as a 4-part drama, when we see it as it's not just 4 distinct ordinances, but it's one ordinance done on 4 different acts of a play, and we participate in that, and that's representative of us, then it takes on a different meaning. But right now, in reading these with baptisms for the dead, they're just barely beginning to open up this modality. They have even no idea what this is going to mean later on. But for right now, they're super excited about it because they come to find out, hey, God's not as big of a jerk as we thought he was. Well, maybe they didn't think he was a jerk, but at least this idea that maybe some people were thrust down to hell had been very prevalent in American Christianity and Christianity in general, going back into Europe. Joseph, this one thing, just like the 3 degrees of glory that we have earlier on, right? That completely opens up this brand new idea of heaven that, oh, look, no one goes to hell, right? There's not a hell in the Mormon construct of eternity. That only maybe a handful of very specific people go to this outer darkness, but like everyone else, other than like these 12 or 15 or 20 people, end up going to heaven. And just a different degree of heaven. And as we said before, this was such a new idea of a merciful God to their day that people literally left the church because they couldn't stand that God would be that merciful. And so you begin to see here is that this idea of baptisms for the dead is a modality of grace, of mercy, of compassion, of healing. You can begin to see how people who had, even if they had loved ones who had been baptized in their religion, to accept the new evolving idea of Mormon priesthood and priesthood in the church, that you needed to be baptized by the true and correct authority. So what does that say for everyone else, even all of your loved ones who were not baptized by the authority? That means that they're condemned, even if they were baptized in their own church. And so this solves all of that. And it just shows, and it kind of expands and makes the conversation bigger than it was before.
I mean, you were talking about how these modes are evolving and changing as they come into an understanding of them and how they're going to fit. It's almost like they are exploring this house, right? And each room they go into is like this new mode, and like, oh, there's another room over here. And it's not like they were dissatisfied with the parts they'd already seen, but it was just like, oh, there's another room, like, and so, oh, there's another way that God is merciful, and so, and this is his mercy is revealed to us through this mode, right? This is another way that God is trying to communicate to us the extents of his mercy, and that they're unbounded, right? And so that happens with baptism for the dead. at first they're going out in the river and they're just, doing it like crazy. And Joseph Smith says, hey, let's baptize men for men and women for women, and let's have a recorder. And so he starts sort of fleshing it out, so to speak, right? It's very vague. It's cloud, right? He starts defining it a little more, how it's supposed to work, and how we do this in an orderly way, and direct us towards the way that we want to understand this. This happens even a longer stretch of time with the concept of sealing, because sealing, when it's first sort of introduced, Joseph doesn't give a whole lot of instruction on what this thing is. And it seems like he doesn't really even know, right? Like sealing is like, okay, let's just seal everybody to everybody, right? Oh, well, I want to be sealed to somebody who's righteous, so I'm going to seal myself to one of the apostles. And so sealing just becomes this method by which people just connect themselves to another righteous person. And that's the way that it's kind of initially first practiced. That is what some of the concept of the plural wives happens under. It's not the total of the story, obviously. There's more going on there. But the concept of sealing, really as it's initially introduced and practiced by the saints, is very different from the way that we see it today. And it changes slightly over time. There's a big change that happens with Wilford Woodruff. And it really fits into this concept of the work for the dead and people being baptized for their ancestors. Because before Wilford Woodruff, sealing was still a pretty haphazard type of thing. Like people would just go in and they'd be like, okay, I want to be sealed to Joseph Smith. Seal me to Joseph Smith. Or I want to be sealed to this apostle. So seal me to this apostle. And it was kind of the way that they connected their families was through some prominent church leader. And Wilford Woodruff came and said, hey, the Lord tells me that's not the right way to do it. Actually, what we're supposed to do is not seal yourself to somebody just because they're a church leader or something. Because people thought that sealing, the way that they practiced this mode was you seal yourself to a righteous person, and that somehow like adds to your righteousness or connects you to God closer because you're sealed to that righteous person. And so that's why they were doing it again with the leaders of the church, because they thought they were more righteous. But Wilford Woodruff comes out and he says, no, that's not what sealing really is supposed to be. Sealing is about families, and we're supposed to connect this chain all the way back to Adam. So actually, the saints didn't have a concept of sealing families all the way back through the generations, far back beyond the restoration of the church, until Wilford Woodruff. And he said that's when you need to start doing that. So then they started doing family history that was much farther back than they ever had before, and started doing that type of temple work and sealing back that way. I learned this because I was reading in my great-great-great-grandfather's journal, and he talked about when Wilford Woodruff introduced this concept and how it just all of a sudden made so much more sense to them. He's like, I don't know why I'd never thought of that before. Of course, that's a better way to do it, and it makes more sense. And it does develop that mode in the direction of the Lord saying, no, sealing isn't about just sealing yourself to a righteous person. That doesn't give you more righteousness. The idea is that we want to unite the whole human family. So you're going to go back and you're going to find your ancestors forever. And we're going to bring everybody together. And everybody's going to be saved because they're all my children. And that development of that mode just kind of opened that concept up, right? It was like you were exploring that room a little bit more and understanding through that mode a little bit more of who God was and how he viewed his children. So,
yeah, that really is a fascinating conversation because of the evolution and what that meant. that to be born under the covenant didn't actually happen until Wilford Woodruff. They searched around and they got to choose like who they wanted to be for their their parent, right? And
exactly.
And who they wanted to be sealed to, and they started jockeying for positions. And in fact, when he revealed this new way of being sealed, there were a lot of apostles who were like, "No, I don't like that. I don't want to be sealed to my earthly father."
Yeah. They're like, "No, my father's a wicked man."
Yeah, he's a wicked.
And Wilford was like, "It doesn't matter."
So yeah, it's absolutely fascinating what became of all that and how that actually evolved and how it's been handed down to us and how we enjoy it nowadays. So just goes to show again that just the way that we have it was not necessarily the way that they understood it then. And so the more we know, we're going to find out that, a lot of these ideas have evolved. And maybe they've evolved. I mean, for instance, Brigham Young, I brought it up. Brigham I can talk. Brigham Young's Adam God theory that was introduced into the temple. And this was a thing that a lot of people have tried to sweep away under the rug and kind of dismiss. But, it was a little bit more prolific than a lot of people want to admit that it was. And so that theory was in the temple. It was in the temple ritual. It was in the temple rites. It was in the temple covenants. And it's not. And it changed. And it changed after he died. And they said, well, we're going to go a different direction with this. And so it's to show grace for each generation and how they're coming to God and to realize that how we enjoy things now, the general principles kind of remain the same in that we have temples. We believe temples function in a particular way in connecting people together. But even that evolved. There's always going to be an evolution as to how this works. So I think it's
there's always somewhat of a cultural context to every mode, right? I mean, a mode, a lot of is going to derive at least some of its meaning from the cultural understanding and context of the person. So it's only going to be useful and as good as far as it not conforms to the culture, but at least like considers it in the way that it conveys the message, in the way that it conveys the opportunity for a connection with God, right? It's not beholden to culture, but it also can't be blind to it. So
yeah, exactly. And this is not a problem of what we're addressing either, because right. I mean, it's the point. It's the very point. It's the entire reason. Yeah,
that's exactly the point. Right.
It's the whole reason why the justification and the reason are given for why we need modern day prophets, because we can't use the mode of 100 years ago if it doesn't work in our modern construct and needs for today. So it changes to match the needs for the day. And I think this is going to be more and more of an important understanding to have, especially in a day and age when fundamentalism is becoming more and more of a problem in the church. And what that we mean by
culture's moving very fast.
Yeah, it does. Things change fast.
Yeah.
And our understandings of things change fast. I mean, just think about what the Joseph Smith Papers has done to a lot of our history, like with the United Order, and how that sent a whole bunch of people into a tailspin. Because if that can't be trusted, it's a very entrenched doctrine and understanding, or what we thought was a doctrine, and come to find out, it's based on not solid history that we found out was not solid history. So we amend ourselves and move on. But that's what fundamentalism is not that you adhere to fundamentals of the gospel. That's not what fundamentalism is. Fundamentalism it's this idea that when you have an initial doctrine, you have an initial experience, right? And you record it in a particular way. Events in and of themselves are meaningless until we add meaning and purpose and identity and all sorts of stories to them. And so each event as it happens sends a ripple effect down through the generations. And each generation reinvents itself about how it identifies and finds meaning in the event in history. And so when a historian is being a good historian, and they go back into history and they find documents and they find things that amend the story and say, hey, this story did not happen like what we thought the story happened like, and here's why, then at that point, then we have to look at the story differently. But from a person who's not a fundamentalist, they're going to be like, oh, okay, well, cool. We thought this thing, and now we think this other thing. But what a fundamentalist does is by changing the story, you also change the meaning of the ripples that have gone down through the generations. And if you place your truthiness, I'm going to borrow an old Steve Colbert phrase. If you borrow your truthiness and you found your truthiness on the ripples, as opposed to be the original event, and you allow that the original event can change into be according to whatever, that event may change. The more we base our testimonies on the ripples and of meaning that have derived from the event, as opposed to having a heart of repentance that will always allow us to see God differently, that at that point, what happens is we end up fighting against progress. We end up doubling down and making dogma an idol to us, and we think we are actually being loyal to the original. And that's what fundamental is its loyalty to the old way of thinking. And it's the loyalty to the old way of thinking as if the old way was the most pure way, as if the way Joseph thought was the most pure thing that it could have been. Now, don't get me wrong, Joseph was awesome. But even Joseph realized that there was going to be a lot of stuff that came after Joseph. And so it's recognizing that this is a forward momentum and that we will always move forward. Every religious movement, every religious denomination has to move forward. And if it keeps on going back to the original, as if the original was the most pure, then number one, it suffers from a nostalgia that never existed in the first place. And it shows that you're probably taking more of your current context and then projecting that back onto history than you think than you actually recognize you're doing. And then you have to double down into dogma, and then you have to retrench because you don't allow yourself to be open for other sources to help refine what that original event was. Now, it is when that original event comes out and we have now more sources or greater knowledge, we can ask better questions about how to identify these moments and find meaning from these moments. The meaning is going to change. But that's Christopher and I had an episode for Latter-day Contemplation here not too long ago where we talked about meaning, and we talked about stories. And it was specifically on stories, that the stories we tell ourselves, a lot of the times we don't live in reality. We live in our stories about reality. And when our stories about reality are based on the ripples of meaning that come from events, we're in a really shaky place, religiously speaking. And the more the culture doubles down using their stories and basing it on the ripples of meaning as opposed to actually finding a way to connect with God directly, that's what's going to cause a really big problem for we're already seeing this problem already in a lot of groups in the church and in a lot of fundamentalist, what will end up being fundamentalist breakoffs. I already know in Utah, there are already groups that are starting to break off because they think that polygamy was the most pure way to live. So they're going to go live polygamy, or they think the law of consecration is the most pure way to live. So they're going to go live in compounds where they just practice the law of consecration. And that's what that kind of thinking ends up doing, is because then you want to live the pure way of living. And the pure way of living is your interpretation of how you think it was supposed to have been, based on the ripples of meaning and not necessarily the thing in and of itself. Anyway, it becomes very highly problematic. So history is difficult.
It's almost like you study religion or something. So.
It's an issue I see. So hopefully someone can glean something from that. If you have any questions or comments about it, definitely drop by, let us know. But hey, Ben, did you have anything else to say here about these sections?
Well, there's a ton of stuff in 128, but I think really I feel like I kind of got to the core of what was standing out to me, what was significant in these sections. Like I said, there's other stuff that I marked up. I know you had some stuff to say about verse 24 about the refiner's fire and stuff, if you want to go into that. If not, then we can save it for another time.
No, I just think it's interesting about, Christ being called the refiner's fire and the fuller's soap, just in that we've had conversations before about what that means. The fuller's soap was made from ash. It was made from the ash of the leftover olive trees. And then we get into the olive tree allegories about how the wicked are supposedly the bad branches that are kept away and burned, and the ash. And the allegories always stop with the wicked being burned. But what the people would have known at the time was that ash was really, really important to these trees, the health of these trees, because it was the ash that got incorporated back into the soil that trapped the water in next to the roots. And if you didn't have that ash to be able to help trap that water near the roots, then it would evaporate and the tree would die. And it also helped to nourish it and to fertilize it.
Well, yeah, when the vineyard's burned, you don't completely kill the trees. What it is if you're talking about an olive vineyard, is that the branches or the part that's above the ground often will become burned or destroyed. But the roots stay good and the shoots come back up, right? And so the things aren't actually destroyed or killed. They are purified or purged or however, refined, as it talks about here in an alchemical sense, right? So if we take that back to individuals, it's not like the Lord is just like killing people off, in like mass destruction,
genocide.
Yeah, it's this is happening on an individual basis, which actually takes us back to our discussion about the temple, right? And how the temple is actually a response to the mass casualty events of human history as an individual, rather than mass casualty, an individual resurrection. And that's what the Lord does. He goes to us individually and refines us, purifies us, and resurrects us, right? And what is burned and destroyed are not a whole entire people, but rather the parts of them that aren't their true self, the parts of them that don't know God. And what's left is what knows God.
Yeah. I love that. I don't have anything to add more than that. I think it's a good place to end.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for listening and sticking around. And again, if you have any comments, thoughts, anything, if you think this would be good for someone to listen to, please share it. And we always love hearing from you. I have officially gotten off Facebook. I've been off Facebook for about 6 weeks, and man, what a difference in my life.
Man, congratulations.
Yeah, it's something else. I feel like I'm out of the loop.
Achievement.
It really is. I feel like I should get a medal for it or something. But
you go to Facebook, ex-Facebook users anonymous.
That's right. And so I'm out of the loop. I'm usually like really, really in the loop and in the know about how these trends are going and what's happening. And I just feel a little bit out of the loop. So now I'm just in my history books and in my religious theory books. So I feel like I feel like if I could make a Facebook post like 200 years ago, I'd be like, good to go. I'd be very current and modern, but right now I don't feel very current and modern. But Lindsay's doing a really good job in being able to monitor the peace studies and posting for peace studies. And so I get the podcasts out to her and she's posting everything there. So thanks to her for everything that she does. And to Kyle and Catherine for editing. You are rock stars. Without you, this would not be possible. So thank you again.
Yeah, absolutely.
So until next week, I'm Shiloh Logan.
I'm Ben Peterson.
Thank you everybody for listening.